The loyal German shepherd, Max, stood rigid in the howling winter storm, his amber eyes locked on the snow-covered doorway. He growled low, ignoring the calming commands of his master, Officer Daniel Carter. Then, a faint knock. 3 timid raps, almost lost beneath the roar of the blizzard. Daniel tightened his grip on the handle, uncertain. When he opened the door, the icy wind rushed in, and there she was, a little girl, no older than 7, drenched in snow, clutching a worn backpack like it was her only lifeline. Her lips quivered as she whispered, "Can I sleep in your garage?" Daniel froze, torn between disbelief and pity. He had no idea that this fragile question, born of desperation, would unravel a hidden darkness in his city and lead him, Max, and the child into a journey that would forever change their lives. Portland, Oregon, lay smothered beneath a brutal curtain of winter. Snow fell in thick sheets that blurred the outlines of the buildings and blanketed every street in a shimmering, frozen silence. The city, usually alive with the bustle of traffic and the chatter of passers-by, was subdued by the storm. Street lamps glowed faintly, their light swallowed by the blizzard, casting ghostly halos over the white drifts. It was a night when even the most resilient souls hurried indoors, seeking warmth and shelter from the merciless wind that rattled windows and howled through alleyways. Yet, inside a modest wooden cabin on the outskirts of the city, one man and his loyal dog kept vigil against the loneliness of the season. Officer Daniel Carter sat in a worn leather chair near the fireplace, the flickering flames painting soft shadows across his face. Daniel was 36 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, his figure carrying the undeniable presence of someone trained to command attention in uniform. His short brown hair bore streaks of silver at the temples, subtle reminders of years of hardship and responsibility far beyond his age. Hazel eyes, deep and weary, often betrayed the sorrow he kept buried. His wife had passed away several winters ago, leaving behind a hollow silence in his life. He lived alone now, and though the city knew him as a reliable police officer, Daniel's private world was marked by quiet grief and unspoken longing for something more than duty. At his feet, sprawled across a thick rug, rested his companion and the only constant presence in his life, Max, a German shepherd, 6 years of age. Max's muscular frame and thick black and brown fur marked him as a working dog, bred for loyalty and resilience. His amber eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, sharp and intelligent, always alert even in repose. Max had served alongside Daniel in countless patrols, his keen instincts often guiding them into danger and back out again. To strangers, Max was imposing, a canine warrior with a commanding bark and a bite that could stop a man in his tracks. But within the safety of the cabin, he was a guardian of a quieter kind, his loyalty evident in the way he never let Daniel out of his sight. The dog had his own scars from past skirmishes, a faint limp in his hind leg on colder nights and a patch of fur thinner than the rest from an old wound. Yet despite these, he carried himself with pride, radiating strength and a kind of patience that mirrored Daniel's own. The storm outside seemed endless, each gust of wind pushing more snow against the cabin walls. Daniel leaned back, sipping slowly from a mug of lukewarm coffee, Max raising his head briefly at the sound of ice pelting against the window. It was the sort of night where no visitor should arrive, which is why the sound that came next unsettled him. 3 faint knocks at the door, hesitant, almost swallowed by the roar of the blizzard. Daniel stiffened, his hazel eyes narrowing. He wasn't a man easily startled, but knocks at such an hour, in such weather, were rarely good news. He set his mug aside, the wooden table creaking under the weight, and rose to his feet. Max was already standing, rigid, ears pricked and tail low, a quiet growl vibrating in his throat. Daniel raised a calming hand, but felt the same instinctive tension coil inside him. Something was wrong, or at least unusual. He moved toward the door, each step deliberate, his boots clicking against the wooden floor. With a gloved hand, he tightened his grip on the handle, uncertain. Outside, the wind screamed, as though urging him to keep the door shut. But the knock came again, softer now, almost a plea. Daniel inhaled deeply, bracing himself, then pulled the door open. The icy wind rushed inside like an intruder, scattering snowflakes across the floor and snuffing the warmth of the fire for a moment. And there she was. A little girl, no older than 7, stood trembling in the doorway. She was small and frail, her body nearly swallowed by a thin, tattered pink wool sweater that clung to her soaked frame. Her light brown hair was a matted, messy halo plastered to her pale skin, snow melting down her cheeks like tears. Her large brown eyes, glassy with cold and fear, looked up at him with a desperation that pierced through the armor of his grief. In her arms, she clutched a worn backpack so tightly it seemed less an object and more a lifeline, her knuckles white from the strain. The thin skirt she wore, frayed at the edges, offered no protection from the storm, and her oversized shoes were soaked through, leaving her toes nearly exposed to the freezing air. She looked less like a child of the city and more like a ghost misplaced by the storm. Her lips trembled, her breath fogging in the air between them, and in the smallest, most fragile voice, she whispered, "Can I sleep in your garage?" The words struck Daniel like a blow. He froze, torn between disbelief and pity. In all his years on the force, he had seen children in pain, families broken by violence or poverty, but never had one appeared on his doorstep in the middle of a blizzard, asking for less than the bare minimum of kindness. His heart twisted. Max, sensing his hesitation, stepped forward. The dog sniffed the air, then the girl herself, his growl fading into a low whine. He nudged her leg gently with his muzzle, then turned his sharp amber eyes back toward Daniel, as though speaking for her. "She is not a threat. She is cold. She needs us." The silent message was enough. Daniel's fingers tightened briefly on the doorknob before he let out a slow breath. "No," he said at last, his voice firmer than he expected. "You're not sleeping in the garage. You're coming inside." The girl blinked, disbelief flashing across her face, followed quickly by a fragile hope. Daniel stepped aside, guiding her in with a protective hand at her shoulder. The warmth of the cabin seemed to blow close around her instantly, though she still shivered violently, snow dripping onto the floor in small puddles. Max walked beside her, his body brushing hers, as if to shield her from the cold she carried with her. As Daniel closed the door against the storm, his eyes caught movement outside, just a flicker in the distance, barely visible through the curtain of snow. A figure, tall and clad in a dark coat, stood far down the street. The man was too far to make out clearly, but the silhouette lingered, unmoving, watching. Daniel's instincts sharpened. He had learned never to ignore the subtle warnings of his environment. Max growled again, ears pinned back, his gaze fixed beyond the door. But in the next instant, the figure melted into the storm, swallowed by snow and shadow. Daniel's hand hovered at the curtain for a moment longer, his mind cataloging the unease. Who would stand outside in weather like this? Why had the figure vanished so quickly? He felt the weight of the unanswered questions pressing down, but he forced himself to let the curtain fall back into place. The girl needed his attention now. He looked down at her again. This fragile child, half frozen, clutching her backpack like it contained her soul. "What's your name?" he asked gently, but she only hugged the bag tighter, her eyes darting nervously toward the fire. Daniel did not press. There would be time later for questions. For now, he simply gestured toward the chair opposite his own, where the glow of the flames promised safety. "Sit down. Warm yourself." Emily, though he did not yet know her name, moved slowly toward the chair, her small feet leaving faint wet prints on the wooden floor. Max followed closely, lying down beside her like a sentinel. Daniel crouched by the fire, feeding another log into the flames, the crackle filling the silence between them. He knew that nothing about this night was ordinary. The storm outside was fierce, but it was the storm inside his heart, and the questions now crowding his mind, that felt far more dangerous. And somewhere beyond those swirling white drifts, the shadow of a man in a dark coat lingered, waiting. The storm had not relented. Outside the small wooden house, Portland was swallowed in white, every street muffled by snow, every rooftop carrying a heavy burden of ice. The city seemed to vanish beneath the blizzard, as though the world itself had shrunk to the radius of Daniel Carter's cabin. The sound of the wind roared against the walls, but within, warmth flickered from the fireplace, promising safety for those inside. Daniel gently draped a heavy wool blanket around the small shoulders of the child who had appeared at his door. She shivered uncontrollably, her lips trembling and her eyes wide with the shock of the cold. Her messy light brown hair clung damply to her pale cheeks, and her thin pink sweater was no match for the ferocity of the storm. He crouched, his large hands carefully peeling off her soaked gloves and setting them on the hearth to dry. She held on tightly to her battered backpack, as if surrendering it would mean losing the only piece of her world that still belonged to her. Max padded forward, his massive paws making little sound against the wooden floor. The 6-year-old German shepherd sniffed the girl again, his sharp amber eyes steady and unthreatening. Slowly, he settled beside her chair, his thick black and brown fur brushing against her legs. Then, with an almost deliberate gentleness, Max laid his head across her knees, as though declaring that she was under his protection now. Daniel watched with quiet astonishment. Max rarely lowered his guard so quickly. The girl's fingers hesitated, then slipped into the fur at his neck. He let out a low sigh, the kind only a dog could make, the sound of reassurance and comfort. Daniel moved to the small kitchen corner of his cabin, its shelves sparsely filled with tins of soup, dry coffee, and a half-empty jar of cocoa powder. He rarely entertained guests, and certainly never children, but something in him stirred, a forgotten instinct of care. He heated milk on the stove, adding the cocoa, whisking until the scent of chocolate began to fill the air. It had been years since that smell lingered in his home, and it hit him unexpectedly, stirring memories of nights when his wife, Claire, had made hot chocolate for neighbors' children during winter holidays. He forced the memory away before it could reopen wounds that had only just begun to scar. When he returned with the steaming cup, the girl's eyes widened with awe, her small fingers wrapped around the mug, absorbing its heat as if she were clinging to life itself. She took a careful sip, then another, and the tightness in her shoulders slowly began to ease. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice fragile but sincere. Daniel offered a nod. "What's your name?" he asked softly. The girl hesitated, her lips pressing together. She glanced toward the backpack clutched against her chest as if it might answer for her. Finally, in the faintest whisper, she said, "Emily." The name lingered in the room like a secret. Daniel studied her again. 7 years old, if he had to guess. Frail, but with a resilience that spoke of surviving more than a child ever should. He knew that look. He had seen it before in children from broken homes and violent neighborhoods. Eyes too old for the faces they belonged to. "Where's your mother?" Daniel ventured carefully. Emily's shoulders hunched beneath the blanket. She stared into the fire, her face reflected in the glow. She works late, at the diner. Sometimes she comes back, sometimes—" Her words trailed off, swallowed by the crackle of flames. She gripped the backpack tighter. "The place we stay, it's not safe. The window is broken. When the wind blows, it feels like knives. And the men downstairs yell. They drink and fight. I can't sleep. Last night, someone kicked the door." Her voice faltered. She took another sip of chocolate, as if trying to drown the memory. Daniel's jaw tightened. He knew the kind of places she described. Cheap, run-down boarding houses where landlords turned blind eyes. Where the vulnerable were left unprotected. Places where children should never be. Max shifted at Emily's feet, his tail thumping softly against the floor, drawing her gaze. For the first time, a flicker of something like a smile touched her face. She reached down, brushing her tiny fingers over his ears. "He's warm," she murmured. Max closed his eyes briefly, pressing closer, as though he understood her need. Daniel felt something stir in his chest at the sound of that small laugh, a laugh so rare in this house since Claire's death. It was as though the cabin itself breathed again, alive with a sound it had long been starved of. Hours passed in this fragile peace, the storm outside howling like a distant threat they no longer feared. Daniel tended the fire, listening to the rhythm of Emily's breathing as it grew steadier. He found himself imagining what it might be like if the cabin wasn't always so silent, if laughter and small footsteps could fill its empty spaces. The thought unnerved him as much as it warmed him. But then, as Emily's eyes began to droop with exhaustion, she spoke again, her words soft and almost lost in the crackle of the fire. "There's a man," she said, her voice trembling, "near the place we live. He wears a black coat. I see him at night sometimes, standing across the street, just standing." She clutched her backpack closer, her knuckles white. "I think he follows us." Daniel's pulse quickened. His mind flashed back to the shadowy figure he had glimpsed through the snowstorm just hours earlier, lingering beyond the door before vanishing into the blizzard. He exchanged a glance with Max, who lifted his head and gave a low growl, as though confirming the connection. Daniel's instincts as a police officer came alive. He had dismissed the figure as a trick of the storm, but now Emily's words gave it weight. The timing, the place, the fear in her voice, none of it could be coincidence. He masked his unease, not wanting to frighten her further. "You're safe here," he assured her. "No one can hurt you while you're with me." Emily's eyes fluttered shut. exhaustion claiming her at last. The blanket slipped slightly from her shoulder, and Max nosed it back into place, guarding her even in sleep. Daniel sat back, staring into the fire, his mind restless. Somewhere out there in the storm was a man in a black coat, watching, and now he knew the child's name, her story, and the fragile thread that bound her to danger. The cabin was warm, but Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow outside. Morning broke quietly over Portland, though the storm of the night before still left its presence in the air. The streets outside Daniel Carter's wooden cabin lay silent beneath a heavy blanket of snow, the roof sagging under the weight, chimneys coughing smoke into the brittle sky. The wind had gentled into a whisper, carrying fine flakes of snow that drifted lazily against frosted windows. The city seemed hushed, like it too was waiting. Inside, the fire in the hearth had dwindled to embers, the warmth holding back the sharp cold that pressed against the cabin walls. Daniel rose from the armchair where he had dozed lightly, still in his dark blue police uniform. His eyes, hazel and lined with weariness, shifted to the child curled on the couch under the thick wool blanket. Emily, small and fragile, slept deeply, her messy light brown hair falling across her pale cheeks. Her pink sweater, though torn and frayed, was now dry, and the heat of the cabin had returned a faint color to her skin. At her side lay Max, the 6-year-old German shepherd, his muscular body coiled protectively, amber eyes half-lidded but alert. His thick black and brown fur rose and fell with each steady breath, and one ear twitched each time the wind brushed the doorframe. Daniel moved quietly, careful not to disturb them, and began tidying the small living space. That was when he noticed the backpack Emily had refused to let go of until exhaustion had claimed her. Now, it sat slumped near the hearth, the zipper slightly open. Out of habit more than curiosity, Daniel reached to close it, but something caught his eye. A faded corner of paper sticking out, yellowed with age, its edges curled and softened. He hesitated, then carefully drew it out. It was a photograph, creased, water-stained, and smudged with the years, but still clear enough. It showed a red brick apartment complex, modest but lively, the kind of place where laundry hung from balconies and children played in the yard. He studied the details and recognition flared. His pulse quickened. He knew this building. Years ago, it had been the center of an investigation into loan sharks who preyed on struggling families. Just then, a soft voice broke the silence. That was our home. Daniel turned to see Emily sitting up, the blanket falling from her shoulders. Her eyes, large and sad, were fixed on the photograph in his hands. She clutched the edge of the couch as though bracing herself. Me and Mom, we were happy there, before everything went bad. Daniel crouched beside her, holding the photograph between them. You lived here? He asked, his tone gentle but intent. Emily nodded, her messy hair bobbing slightly. There were flowers on the balcony. Mom baked cookies on Sundays. We used to sit on the steps and watch the neighbors. Everyone was kind. Her voice faltered, the words trailing into silence. Then the landlord said we had to leave. Mom cried so much. She tried to pay, but she couldn't. They said she owed money we didn't borrow. Daniel's brows drew tight. He remembered those files, names crossed out, families displaced. He had chased whispers of forged contracts, false debts, and quiet threats, but the investigation had been buried under bureaucracy and fear. And now, sitting across from him, was a child holding the human cost of those forgotten cases. He placed the photo gently back in the backpack. Emily, he said slowly, that building, I know it. I looked into it once. Bad people were involved. People who take homes away from families who can't fight back. Emily pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her lips trembling. That's why we left. Mom said it wasn't safe to ask questions. She just wanted us to find another place. She hugged her backpack again, as though it were armor. Max lifted his head, ears pricking at the shift in Daniel's voice. Daniel scratched the fur at the dog's neck, grounding himself. Well, he murmured, maybe it's time someone did ask. Later that afternoon, once Emily had eaten a small breakfast of eggs and toast, Daniel clipped Max's leash and stepped into the snow-laden streets. He told Emily to stay by the fire, promising he would not be long. His boots crunched through the drifts, each step carrying him closer to a place he thought he had left behind years ago. The red brick apartment complex loomed at the end of a block, abandoned now, its windows dark and broken, doors chained shut. Snow had gathered in the stairwells, and icicles clung to the eaves like glass fangs. It was a shell of what it had once been, but Daniel could still see traces, the faint outlines of where flower pots once sat, the graffiti scrawled in faded paint, a child's forgotten toy, half buried in ice. Max sniffed the air, his breath fogging in the cold. His sharp amber eyes darted toward the alley beside the building. He tugged at the leash, leading Daniel with steady insistence. They followed the path until it ended at an old warehouse, its corrugated metal sides bent and rusted, half hidden under layers of snow. Daniel frowned, scanning the structure. It had no business being here, so close to a residential block. Max growled low, pawing at the door, his muscles tense. Daniel tried the handle. It was locked, but the frost-stained padlock hung loosely, as if hastily placed. He pried it open and pushed the door. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint odor of damp paper and mildew. Light filtered through cracks in the walls, casting sharp beams across the floor. Stacks of boxes lined the walls, some toppled, their contents spilling out. Daniel crouched, brushing aside snow that had crept under the door. His eyes narrowed. Scattered across the floor were documents, forged lease agreements, fake eviction notices, even counterfeit IDs. He picked up a sheet, scanning the names and addresses. Families, mothers, children, the signatures were shaky, some clearly forced. His gut clenched. Max barked suddenly, his deep voice reverberating through the empty space. Daniel spun, his hand instinctively moving to the grip of his holstered weapon, but the warehouse remained still, the only movement the dance of dust motes in the light. Max stood rigid, staring toward the far corner, where shadows pooled. His growl rumbled low and steady. Daniel stepped closer, but the corner was empty save for more boxes and an overturned chair. Still, the unease remained. Someone had been here recently. He could feel it. He gathered a few of the documents into his coat, intending to bring them back. This, he thought grimly, was the thread that could unravel everything. As he pulled the door shut behind them, Max gave a final low growl toward the warehouse, then fell silent. The snow swirled around them, covering their tracks as they made their way back toward the cabin. Inside, Emily was waiting by the window, her small figure pressed against the glass as though afraid he would not return. When he stepped inside, shaking the snow from his uniform, she rushed to him, her backpack still clutched against her chest. Max brushed past, nudging her gently before curling once more by the fire. Daniel knelt, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Emily," he said firmly, "I found something today. Papers. Lies. The kind of lies that take homes away. I think this is why you and your mom lost yours." Emily's eyes widened, shimmering with a mixture of fear and fragile hope. "Does that mean they did it on purpose?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "Yes. And now we have to find out who." The storm outside had eased, but inside, a new one was gathering. A storm of questions, secrets, and the shadow of a man in a black coat, who seemed to linger wherever Emily's story turned. And Daniel knew this was only the beginning. The snow had only thickened by afternoon, falling in heavy sheets that blurred the outlines of Portland's streets. The city seemed to move slower beneath the storm, as if its breath had frozen. Daniel Carter drove cautiously, his squad car humming through the whiteness. The heater struggled against the chill, fogging the windows in uneven patches. In the back seat, Emily sat curled up with her backpack clutched tight, her wide brown eyes watching the storm beyond the glass. Beside her, Max lay with his head pressed against her knee, his amber eyes scanning the world outside as though the snow itself might conceal an enemy. Daniel's hands tightened around the wheel as he guided the car toward a small corner of the city. He had learned, after Emily's quiet confession, that her mother worked at a local diner near 12th Street, pulling shifts long past midnight to make ends meet. The place was old and worn, the kind of establishment where neon signs flickered above chipped linoleum floors, but it was a beacon for those who had little else. The diner came into view, its glowing sign barely visible through the curtain of falling snow. Daniel parked along the curb, the tires crunching ice as the car settled. "Ready?" he asked gently, turning toward Emily. She nodded, though her trembling hands betrayed her nerves. Max gave a low, reassuring huff, brushing his muzzle against her side. They pushed through the door, a small bell jingling above their heads. Warmth and the scent of frying food enveloped them instantly, a sharp contrast to the storm outside. The diner was half filled with tired truck drivers and bundled workers, each hunched over mugs of steaming coffee. Behind the counter, a woman in a faded uniform darted between tables, balancing plates with quick, practiced hands. Her face was pale with exhaustion, framed by long brown hair pulled back tightly. Dark circles under her eyes hinted at sleepless nights, and her thin frame spoke of someone who had given more than she had received. Yet there was a quiet resilience in the set of her shoulders, a strength born of necessity. This was Sarah, Emily's mother. "Mom!" Emily's voice rang out, small yet piercing enough to cut through the clatter of dishes. Sarah froze mid-step, the tray trembling in her grip. Slowly she turned, her tired eyes locking onto her daughter's face. The tray slipped from her fingers, crashing onto the counter as she stumbled forward, tears already streaming down her cheeks. She dropped to her knees, arms outstretched, and Emily barreled into her embrace. "My baby," Sarah sobbed, clutching Emily as though she might vanish if she let go. She pressed frantic kisses into the girl's damp hair, rocking her gently despite the tears. Emily wept too, her small frame trembling, her face buried in her mother's neck. I thought I'd lost you," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. Daniel stood quietly nearby, his presence solemn but steady. Max sat at his side, his sharp gaze sweeping the room, every muscle tense. When Sarah finally looked up at Daniel, suspicion flickered briefly in her exhausted eyes. "Who are you?" she asked, pulling Emily closer protectively. "I'm Officer Daniel Carter," he said simply, his voice steady. "Emily came to me last night in the storm. She was alone. I couldn't let her freeze." Sarah's face crumpled again, a mixture of gratitude and shame. She kissed her daughter's hair once more before whispering, "Thank you." Later, seated in a corner booth, Sarah spoke in halting words. She confessed that after losing their home, she had been targeted by men who claimed she owed debts her late husband had never taken. They had threatened her, following her in shadows, whispering promises of violence if she resisted. With nowhere else to go, she had been forced into shelters, then into long shifts at the diner, trying desperately to shield Emily while drowning in fear. "I just wanted to keep her safe," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "But every time I close my eyes, I see them waiting. Men in black coats, outside the shelter, outside this place. They don't let go. They won't let us go." Her thin hands trembled as she gripped the chipped coffee cup, knuckles white. Daniel listened carefully, his hazel eyes steady but darkened with resolve. He had suspected the connection after seeing the forged documents in the warehouse. But Sarah's words confirmed the scale of it. This wasn't just about one family. This was a system of fear feeding on the vulnerable. At that moment, Max's low growl vibrated against the booth's metal frame. His ears pricked forward, his body rigid. Daniel followed his gaze toward the fogged diner window. Through the haze of falling snow, a figure stood across the street. A tall man in a thick dark coat, a black knit beanie pulled low, his breath plumed in the frigid air as he lingered, unmoving, watching. Daniel rose swiftly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Stay here," he ordered Sarah firmly, then moved for the door with Max straining at the leash. The freezing wind slammed into him as he pushed into the street, snow stinging his face. The man turned the instant Daniel emerged, breaking into a run down the narrow alley. "Go, Max," Daniel commanded, unclipping the leash. The German shepherd bounded ahead, his powerful legs slicing through the drifts with astonishing speed. His bark echoed off the brick walls, sharp and commanding. Daniel followed, his boots crunching over ice as he sprinted. The chase wound through snow-clogged streets and half-empty alleys. The man slipped once, regained his footing, but Max closed the distance quickly. With a leap, the shepherd slammed into the man's side, driving him into the snow. The man cursed, struggling beneath sharp teeth and heavy paws until Daniel arrived, cuffing his wrists with practiced precision. When Daniel yanked the beanie from his head, the man was revealed. Late 20s, lean but wiry, with narrow eyes and a scar running across his cheek. His clothing reeked of smoke and alcohol. "Who sent you?" Daniel demanded, his voice sharp against the storm. The man sneered, spitting into the snow. "You don't know what you're in the middle of, cop. You can't save them. Nobody can." But Daniel found more than defiance. In the man's pocket was a folded set of papers, addresses, names, coded numbers, evidence, the very kind that could tie this shadowy network to the illegal evictions. Dragging the man back to the squad car, Daniel radioed his superior officer, Captain Harold Simmons. Simmons was a stout man in his 50s, graying hair at his temples, with the hardened demeanor of someone who had spent decades on the force. His voice crackled through the radio. "Carter, bring him in. If this is what I think it is, we'll need a full-scale investigation. We can't let this rot spread any further through our city." Back inside the diner, Sarah clung to Emily as though letting go might break her. Daniel returned with Max, brushing snow from his uniform. He met Sarah's weary eyes, his voice low but resolute. "You're not alone anymore. We're going to stop them. Not just for you, but for every family they've broken." Sarah's lips quivered, tears welling again, but this time there was a glimmer of hope behind them. And outside, as the snow fell heavier, Daniel knew a storm of a different kind was about to begin. The storm finally began to break, though Portland still wore its white shroud like a heavy quilt. The streets were quieter now, less hostile, as though the city itself had been holding its breath and was finally exhaling. In the police precinct, the hum of typewriters and the static crackle of radios filled the air as the case that had haunted Daniel Carter for days reached its turning point. The evidence he had pulled from the warehouse, paired with the papers recovered from the man in the black beanie, was enough to unravel the web of intimidation and fraud. With his report and Captain Simmons' authorization, a full-scale operation had gone into motion. Max, the 6-year-old German shepherd with thick black and brown fur and amber eyes, had been crucial in more ways than Daniel had expected. His keen nose and sharp instincts had tracked the suspects through alleys, unearthed stashed documents, and more than once alerted them before danger could arrive. The canine stood quietly at Daniel's side now in the precinct, his muscular frame pressed against the officer's leg, as though aware of the gravity of the moment. Within 48 hours, the network of loan sharks who had plagued the poorest corners of the city was dismantled. Arrests had been made across multiple districts, men dragged from dingy offices, warehouses stripped bare of forged contracts, and frightened tenants finally able to breathe without fear of a midnight knock. Daniel, though exhausted, felt a weight lift from his chest. It was justice long overdue. Sarah arrived at the precinct that evening, her slim figure dwarfed by the oversized coat she wore against the cold. Her pale face still carried the shadows of sleepless nights, but her eyes, brown and tired though they were, now held a spark of something new, hope. Emily clung to her hand, her messy light brown hair sticking out in every direction, her pink sweater still patched, but warmer now under layers of scarves donated by neighbors. "Officer Carter," Sarah said quietly, her voice breaking as she looked at him. "I don't know how to thank you." Daniel shook his head, his hazel eyes soft. "You don't need to thank me. This city failed you before. It was my job to make sure it didn't happen again." But still, gratitude lingered in her gaze, unspoken but strong. Emily, in her small, tremulous voice, whispered, "We don't have to run anymore, do we?" Daniel knelt to meet her eyes. "No," he said firmly, his breath fogging in the winter air. "You're safe now." The precinct was no place for them to linger, so Daniel made arrangements. With the support of the city's victim relief program, a modest apartment had been secured on the east side of Portland, in a quiet block where families lived side by side. The building was nothing fancy, white stucco walls dusted with snow, small balconies hung with strings of faded lights. But it was safe, it was warm, and most importantly, it was theirs. That evening, Daniel drove Sarah and Emily through the hushed streets. The snow had stopped falling, though it still lay in deep banks along the sidewalks, glowing faintly beneath the street lamps. Emily pressed her face to the glass, her breath fogging the window as she watched the unfamiliar neighborhood pass by. Max sat upright in the front passenger seat, his amber eyes flicking between Daniel and the world outside, as if guarding this new chapter as carefully as he had the last. When they reached the building, Sarah gasped softly. Emily clutched her hand tighter, her small body shaking with anticipation. Daniel led them inside, carrying a box of supplies under one arm. The stairwell was narrow but clean, the scent of fresh paint lingering faintly. At the end of the hall, Daniel stopped before a simple wooden door and unlocked it. The apartment was small. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with counters worn smooth by years of use, and a living room with a window that looked out onto the snowy street. The heater hummed gently, filling the air with warmth that banished the chill instantly. Sarah stepped inside slowly, her eyes glistening as she took in the sight. Emily, however, ran ahead, her torn pink sweater bouncing as she skidded to a halt in the center of the living room. She spun around, her cheeks flushed with sudden tears. "We have a home," she whispered at first, then louder, her voice breaking. "We have a home for real." She fell to her knees, clutching her backpack tight against her chest as though it could now finally rest. Her sobs shook her small frame, but they were not the sobs of fear. They were the sobs of release, of relief. Sarah dropped beside her, wrapping her arms around her daughter, the two holding each other, as if the world had stopped. Daniel stood quietly at the doorway, his throat tight. Max padded over, sitting beside Emily, his great head pressing into her lap. Emily reached down, fingers tangling in the thick fur, and whispered through her tears, "Max, you're my hero." The dog's amber eyes blinked slowly, and he let out a deep, contented sigh, as if accepting the title without question. That night, Daniel stayed to share their first meal in the new apartment. Sarah cooked a simple dinner, pasta and bread, food she could make quickly with the limited groceries Daniel had brought. They sat around the small wooden table, the heater humming in the corner, snow drifting softly outside. Emily laughed for the first time in days, her small voice filling the room with a sound that felt almost sacred. She fed Max scraps under the table, and he accepted them with quiet dignity, tail thumping against the floor. Sarah, watching the scene, finally allowed herself to smile, a weary but genuine smile that softened her tired features. "I thought I'd lost everything," she admitted, her eyes on Daniel. "But maybe we're starting again." Daniel didn't answer immediately. He watched, Emily giggling as Max nudged her elbow, watched Sarah's hand brush absently through her daughter's hair, and felt something stir in his chest he hadn't felt since before his wife's passing. A sense of family, a sense of belonging. He hadn't expected to find it again, yet here it was, fragile but real, blossoming like a light against the snow. When dinner ended, Daniel stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the quiet street. The snow had stopped completely now, the night sky clear enough to reveal a scattering of stars. The light from the apartment spilled warmly across the frosted glass, cutting through the darkness outside. For the first time in years, Daniel felt at peace. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not written in the skies or whispered by angels, but carried out through quiet acts of love, courage, and faith. A little girl who once had no roof over her head found warmth. A mother who thought all hope was lost discovered safety, and a man who believed his family was gone forever found a new home in his heart. It was not by chance but by the hand of God working through compassion, persistence, and the loyalty of a faithful dog. In our everyday lives, we may also face storms of fear, loneliness, or uncertainty. But just as the snow gave way to light in this story, God reminds us that no night is too dark for His grace to reach. When we open our doors, when we care for one another, when we dare to believe in something greater than ourselves, miracles unfold before our very eyes. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share it with others so that more people may feel the hope it carries. Comment below and let us know your thoughts, or simply write amen if you too believe that God still performs miracles through love and kindness. And remember to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of faith, courage, and second chances. May God bless you and your loved ones, today and always. Amen.